Hi, everyone. Welcome back to iPolitics' signature podcast, No Talking Points. I'm one of your co-hosts, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief here at iPolitics. I'm joined, as always, by my second co-host, Brian Storseth, our publisher here at iPolitics. We have a terrific show for you today with three excellent guests. Laura Kurkimaki is a senior vice president at McMillan Vantage and also was a deputy national campaign manager for the 2021 Conservative campaign. Claire Seaborn is a lawyer with Torys in Toronto. She's also a former chief of staff to Jonathan Wilkinson, who will soon be our ambassador to the European Union. And Aya Dufour is iPolitics and Major Projects reporter. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I do the spiel every week, but a lot to discuss, lots to go through. I'm going to kind of turn the clock back just ever so slightly to Friday. We had a very, very big kind of regulatory package rolled out. It was teased a bit in advance. I did some excellent reporting on what to expect. We've seen that package be brought forward saying, hey, we're out for consultations, but we've already seen the criticism come forward, including from Catherine McKenna, who's kind of implying that it turns back a lot of those Trudeau era climate policies. I'll start with you, Aya, just based on your story. Like, how big of a deal is this, to put forward a very overly simplistic question? How big of a deal is this when it comes to how we approve big projects in this country?
Well, I'll put it this way. It's been a few days since the package was released, and I'm still digesting it. So it feels really big. It touches on a lot of stuff, some stuff that is sort of easy picking, like easy to accomplish. Concurrent permitting makes so much sense, right? It's the same people doing the evaluation and the permitting. So having that being done at the same time makes a lot of sense and could speed things up. This 1 year timeline thing seems doable in some ways, although they were already doing some consultations about how they were going to bring it down to 2 years. So I don't know what is going to have to go for it to be achievable in a 1 year time frame. And there's this thing about deadlines, especially when they're enshrined in law. Deadline, you can meet it, but it doesn't mean that it's quality stuff. And I think we all know what I mean by that. Sometimes you kind of send it and you're like, this is the best I could do in the time that I had, and you're happy with it, but it's not necessarily the best work that you can do. So I do worry about the stuff that's maybe going to fall through the cracks as we try to speed things up. Because ultimately, if things do fall through the cracks, this is public purse stuff, right? Like it's ultimately us as a collective society that's going to foot the bill for a costly remediation project, for a project that failed because we didn't properly assess its chances and its likelihood of success. So there's sort of those are my initial thoughts. And then obviously another really big piece is this special economic zones proposal, which is very light in the discussion paper that we saw. Like, we don't have a lot of information for how big of a suggestion this is, right? Like, to pre-approve projects that are already in a specific zone. Pre-approval sort of builds on what we've already seen in the Building Canada Act, but if you apply it sort of more broadly, I think it has wider repercussions. And I think it might have been a bit intentional that we didn't see a lot of details on that proposal, because details invite scrutiny. And so I would be very curious to see how they put legislation forward on this, and especially legislation that doesn't invite a court challenge, because I don't see how any of these proposals are gonna be free from that. So those were my initial thoughts, but I'm so excited to hear what Claire thinks, because her firm penned a great piece on it as well this week.
Yeah, Claire, please. This is the problem when I have guests who are smarter than me. If this happens every week, please help us digest what we're talking about. I think I gave us a kind of preliminary rundown, but yeah, please help us understand what was announced on Friday.
Sure. So I'm a major projects lawyer. There are more than 12 different federal departments and agencies that are responsible for project permits and reviews. That is a lot. I like to call that the spider web of federal regulations. And I think Friday's announcement was a strong attempt to start to untangle that spider web for project proponents, but also for members of the public and Indigenous groups and everyone that is trying to navigate this very complicated and very time-consuming process. I already referred to the timeline, so let's talk about that. In the tail end of the Trudeau era, the commitment was 5 years for federal projects to be approved through any federal process, so both the impact assessment review process and any permits that come through other departments. Carney has said that he wants to bring that down to 2 years, and the announcement on Friday talks about 1 year. And I'm just going to tell you how I read this. So how I read it is that we've got a 1 year period when project proponents submit their information and their studies, and then a second 1 year period when the federal government is responsible for reviewing that information and making its final decisions. So even though it wasn't extremely clear in the paper, I think that the 1 year timeline referred to in the discussion discussion paper on Friday is in fact consistent with the 2-year timeline that the Carney government has been talking about since they took office. So we're talking about Trudeau-era 5-year target service standard down to a 2-year period with a 1-year federal review period that will, according to this discussion paper, be enshrined in law. Listen, I think that's great. It is really important that we get major projects built quickly, and that's all kinds of projects, even the ones that we desperately need for clean electricity, for critical minerals, for building the clean economy and reaching net zero. So I just think it's very important. Trade corridors, diversification from the United States. I will say that the concerns around the environment are very legitimate. And what I don't want to see is that this is skirting environmental laws or skirting Indigenous consultation in a way that I alluded to results in more litigation, because that's not good for anybody. That's not good for the projects, and it's not good for the people who have interests in those projects. So I think the government needs to be really careful about how they implement the special changes that they're talking about here, whether that's the economic zones, whether it's other forms of pre-approval, because there is a huge litigation risk here. And I think that's very obvious. I mean, there's more things I could go into, but why don't we turn it to Laura? And I'm happy to keep chatting if you guys want to hear more.
Yeah. Well, Laura, I'm curious. What's your take? I mean, I feel like the Conservatives have kind of been banging the drum for a while, saying this process is way too labyrinth, sinking investment. So, are you guys kind of smirking a bit, saying, you guys are kind of stealing our ideas once again on this stuff?
Well, that has been going on a lot lately. I think, unlike Claire and Aya, I think I'm coming at it more from the political side of things. I think that the Prime Minister has been saying for over a year that he's going to get pipelines built, projects built, and that just hasn't happened. He's trying to, like in this case, is trying to speed up projects, but Parliament already gave the Prime Minister sweeping powers under Bill C5 last summer. And almost a year later, he still hasn't used those powers to approve a single new project. So I think Conservatives will continue to support any, I think, oil and gas development, good paying jobs, etc. But it just kind of seems like another step when there are things that he can do before this to approve projects and get things going if he wants. There's new crown corporations that are popping up all the time. Government's getting bigger. It just seems like it's yet another step when he could already be doing things to move things along. So I'm not too sure what is different this time than the time before that.
That's a good point. I mean, Brian, I know this is something you've also been kind of pounding the pavement on in terms of the need to get things done quickly. And you've blamed the kind of a bureaucratic process here. To Laura's point, though, what is different from this than what we've seen in C5? Or is it all just a kind of workaround to get around the fact that there's some policies that put in place maybe by the previous government that this government wants to undo?
Well, it does seem like this is a return to repealing pieces of key Trudeau legislation. I mean, in fact, I think this government's almost repealed more pieces of Trudeau legislation than it has built new pieces of legislation in its first year. But I actually have a question on this to Claire or to Laura. We're talking about the government's announcement seems like this is an initiative that's moving forward. But if I read this right, this is the launching of a discussion paper, isn't it? What would be next steps after the 30 days of discussion on this?
Yeah, so this is a discussion paper, and at the end of this engagement period, which ends on June 7th, the government has promised to introduce legislation, consult on regulations, and implement policies. And I have to say, I don't agree with you that this is a repeal of Trudeau-era policies. It's actually a building on the Impact Assessment Act that the Trudeau government put in place. And I think that these changes, they don't actually they're not going to remove sections from the Impact Assessment Act. They're going to build on that. And just to give an example, there's a section in the Impact Assessment Act about creating regional assessments, looking at regions as areas for potential development. And the proposal on Friday proposes to add zones, economic zones that build on those regional assessments so that project proponents know that this is a zone where we anticipate that development will occur. And a lot of that consultation with Indigenous groups, with municipalities, with environmental groups can happen earlier in the process. So I don't really see it as a repeal. There's some minor elements of it that do go back to the Harper era. For example, having the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the Canada Energy Regulator make the final decision on projects. That is a move to the same process that happened in Harper under the CIA 2012. But otherwise, I actually see it in many ways as a building on. And just to respond to Laura's point on projects, interestingly, people criticize the Carney government for not getting enough projects moving. I just don't think that's true. If you looked on the Impact Assessment Agency website, they have approved several projects. And then more interestingly, the other thing that the Impact Assessment Agency has done is decided not to review a number of projects, which means that, in fact, they're saying the provinces get to review those projects and the federal government's going to stay out of it. And I know it's not as splashy and political for the Carney government to say, we're announcing that we're not going to decide about this project, but actually that does help some projects move more quickly if you leave the process to the provinces, as the Carney government is doing with cooperation agreements with all the different provinces.
No,
Claire,
and that's a,
here.
sorry, that's a really good point. But so are you saying that it's not that significant, the changes to the navigable waters, species at risk? To me, those are things that are actually going back to the Harper budget bill that was passed, or even in regards to species at risk, going beyond where Prime Minister Harper went with it.
Yeah, there is a proposed exemption on the Species at Risk Act, the Navigable Waters Act, and also on the Fisheries Act. Those three are very targeted, specific exemptions, and I do not see them as equivalent to the wholesale repeal that the Harper government did of that legislation. You know, the Carney government's not proposing to repeal the entire Navigable Waters Act. They're proposing to speed up the process and allow exemptions in certain cases, especially when we're talking about projects that are really, really important to the country, important to meeting our climate targets, important to diversifying our trade. And, you know, I just don't see it quite as much of a repeal. I understand environmentalists are very concerned, and they should be. They have an important role to play, and they should keep looking closely at how the government treats those individual projects. Aya mentioned this concept of pre-approval. And I think it's important to mention that even if a project is pre-approved by cabinet, it will still be subject to legally binding conditions. And Indigenous groups, environmental groups, local groups will be able to ensure that those conditions are there and ensure that they're enforced as well.
And just to be clear, June 7th will be basically the end of this sitting session, so there won't be any legislation proposed until September or October.
It's unclear to me when the government will introduce legislation on this. It's possible that they could introduce the bill, but we don't know at this time.
Some government officials told me that they are going to introduce table legislation by the end of the session. Doesn't mean they're going to pass it, of course.
Which I think the purpose of that is to have the discussion paper, introduce the legislation, allow further consultation over the summer on the legislation itself. But, you know, again, it might be the government taking advantage of the majority and trying to move quickly. And like I said, I do think all kinds of project approvals do go too slowly right now. And this is a good attempt to untangle that spider web.
If we can talk about a similar topic, although maybe not quite as related, looks like talks are heating up between Alberta and Ottawa on reaching a deal on carbon pricing as part of that broader MOU. Aya, maybe I'll start with you again. What are you hearing about where things stand with those two sides as we potentially, or we hear drumbeats towards a deal being reached?
I think Carney's climate credibility really depends on the timeline for hitting 130 per ton in Alberta in the tier system. Because when he presented this climate competitiveness strategy, I think lots of people were saying, okay, well, this could still work. You know, we're repealing these other key pieces of environmental legislation, but if we get carbon pricing right, then we can offset some of those other consequences that come from letting go of those policies. What we're hearing right now is 2040 as a timeline to hit $130 per ton. I doubt that we're going to see anyone on the environmental side happy with that timeline, just because I think we've seen some of the latest modeling from 440 megatons. They were saying like a weak scenario would be reaching it in 2035. And if, 2040 wouldn't really translate to significant emissions reductions, I think, by most modeling, but it might make pathways carbon capture viable, which is, I think, the priority of the Carney government. So maybe that's the sweet spot that they're landed in these negotiations, not landing on a timeline that effectively reduces emissions, but landing on a timeline that allows for a big project like that to be economically viable. So I'm really excited to see. The rumor is that as we speak, Mark Carney's presenting this deal to his cabinet, and then he might fly to Alberta by the end of the week to announce it. And that's going to be a major moment, I think, for our country.
Yeah. Laura, what do you think about that? Is this deal, is this a huge coup for Carney? Is it, maybe Daniel Smith scoring a political victory here? What's your read on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen the two actually work surprisingly well together. over the last year or so. I think it strikes me that the Prime Minister has probably put quite a bit of effort into building and fostering that relationship. I think I was seeing something somewhere yesterday where folks are expecting the full agreement will be announced later this week. And it just looks like there are some details going back and forth. So I guess we will know more soon. I think just broadly on the climate emissions reduction, I think I would be safe in saying that the premier is probably only going to sign a deal that's going to be good for Alberta and not hurting the oil and gas sector in any way there. So it's going to be really interesting to see if Alberta gets any carve-outs or anything special sort of way that the province can also help speed up projects. I will say just on all of this, it obviously makes it awkward. I think we're probably going to get into this, but within the Liberal caucus, just given some of the reactions, we already talked about, obviously, Catherine McKenna, but I also enjoyed Stephen Guilbeault's comments, who proclaimed that the proposed reforms from the Prime Minister's are worse than Prime Minister Harper's. So I think we're going to see, depending what Alberta gets, there's a lot of political liability for the Prime Minister here.
Yeah, I was going to say, Laura, it feels like maybe the Conservatives are bracing for some sort of blowback for the Liberals when it comes to the people, in their caucus or their voter base who are concerned about the environment. I just got to ask, considering the position of the NDP and the Greens right now, do you really think that that's going to happen, that there's going to be a severe weakening in Liberal support because of this, considering where, the political landscape we're dealing with right now?
I don't think so. You've seen Guilbeault has really been the only one that has commented, I think, too much. I do find it interesting that other former environment ministers and other folks have largely been fairly silent while all of this has been going on, which I find really interesting. I don't know if the Liberal caucus doesn't realize that maybe they have a little bit more potential impact than they think they do here. It's a 1-seat majority. Surely if there were even 2 or 3 or 4 MPs that were unhappy with either inaction on the environment or rolling back some of Prime Minister Trudeau's legislation, if some are gonna be saying that this is worse than what Prime Minister Harper did, I suspect there are others that probably fall at least somewhere in the unhappy scale. But I do find it, to your point, I think the Liberals are polling very well, obviously. Things are going well for them. So I don't know if perhaps has something to do with it. Maybe they think they can't influence things as much. But it is interesting that I think we haven't seen more reaction from MPs that care about the environment and care about climate as sort of like one of their top issues.
Yeah, it's always going to be a balancing act. I'm curious to hear from you, Claire. How do you, if you're Mark Carney, how do you kind of sell this to people in both camps, saying this is what we need to do to help, help diversify our economy and help, generally support it during a time where we're facing severe headwinds, but at the same time, we're still being conscientious of our environmental impact. How do you sell that to your base? How do you sell it to Canadians at large?
What Canadians care about right now is cost of living, economic growth, U.S. diversification, housing. And the good news for Carney is that so much climate action touches on each of those things. And the best thing that the Carney government can be doing, free advice, is have strong climate action and communicate it through the lens of those top priorities for Canadians. I think the Carney government runs into more trouble when they try to talk about climate in a vacuum, and it's really hard for people to understand. It becomes highly political and very heated. But when we saw, for example, EV's announcement, that was an economic focus, that went well. When we talk about energy efficiency, we can talk about cost of living. That goes well. I think one of the reasons the nature announcement of reaching a goal of protecting 30% of Canada's nature by 2030, one of the reasons that went so well is because it really played into that sense of patriotism that Canadians have right now. We are and should be really proud of our natural environments. And when they saw the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister talking about the natural environment that way, it landed really well for Canadians. So I just think that we should be talking about climate in that sense. Just going back briefly to the Alberta MOU, what I will say is it's important to go back to basics, which is that the Alberta-Canada MOU commits to net zero by 2050. That means something. We can't forget that they've committed to that. And as Aya said, I'm going to be looking really closely on what what are the timelines here? If we're talking about $130 a ton in the year 2040, it doesn't leave a lot of time for the Alberta economy to completely decarbonize by the year 2050. 10 years is extremely short. Similarly, if Alberta does end up getting an equivalency agreement on the clean electricity regulations, by what timeline does Alberta have to decarbonize its electricity sector? The answer cannot be 2050. You can't decarbonize your electricity sector in the year 2050 and reach net zero as an entire economy by 2050. So I just will encourage people to look closely at those timelines. And then the second thing I'm going to be looking really closely at is who is putting money on the table, because an agreement between a province and the federal government, in my view, and in my experience from working in the government, is only as good as the money that each side put into it. Otherwise, it's something that doesn't generally hold a lot of weight and doesn't last over time. And the federal government's put quite a bit of money on the table with tax credits, with investments in major projects. And I'm really curious to see what kind of money Alberta is willing to put on the table to back up the commitments that it might be making in this agreement. Yeah, that's really my main comment on the Alberta MOU.
I appreciate that. Aya, can you maybe, Claire brings up a good point about timelines. If we're still working to 2050, the timeline you mentioned, 2040, like to Claire's point, how do we make those two make sense? Like, does something need to budge here?
I mean, that's another thing we're going to be paying attention to in this deal that's going to come up is the mechanisms that they're going to use to control the carbon market in Alberta. Like, are they going to remove some of the compliance obligations? Are they going to remove the ability to recirculate credits or to bank them? Because that's some things that some industry are using to sort of play with the demand and supply in that market. So I think either way, there's a lot of credits right now in that market. The government's going to have to buy some of them up to sort of recalibrate things. And like Claire said, I'm also expecting to see Alberta put some money where its mouth is. Like, we're going to see some contracts for difference where Alberta is going to sort of bet against its own future self, not changing its policy on carbon. And I think that's going to be a very good signal for industry. So yeah, beyond the timeline, there's some of these details about how the government is going to intervene in the carbon market that matter a lot. But in terms of what Claire is saying about we're in this moment where everyone is focusing on economic diversification and cost of living, I think that's very true. We have, the upcoming CUSMA negotiations, and the war on Iran is, grabbing a lot of the attention in the headlines. But I do feel also that we're one really bad wildfire summer away from people caring about the environment again. And so the political climate right now might be very different from the one that we're going to see in October. Part of the strategy for the Carney government is also about future-proofing against those changes in social and societal sentiment towards the environment and the importance of climate policy.
Well, Brian, I feel like you kind of had a front row seat when your time in government dealing with that kind of complex web or dealing with major pipeline projects. What's your kind of read about how the Liberals need to navigate this rapprochement with Alberta on carbon pricing, while to, both Claire and Aya's points, working towards a broader goal, a pretty big, significant goal of hitting net zero by 2050?
Yeah, look, if I could be wrong on this, conversations about 2040, 2050, 70, right now, people are feeling the pinch. The government understands that. Prime Minister Carney's well aware that what he needs to do is have major impacts on the economy and start moving some projects forward. He's kind of thrown his hat over the wall to steal Jim Flaherty saying, and decided that the pipeline is something he's going to put a lot of political capital into, which I think is great. So, I mean, the conversations about some of these aspirational goals, while important, certainly are not, I think, what's going to drive the politics of this and the economics of this, which is what I think the government and Canadians are focused on right now. And the whole conversation around carbon credits and the tier system and all of it is a bit of a quagmire for anybody that's been in. I've been into that market and researched it quite heavily, and that is a quagmire, and there's a lot of things that are going to have to get sorted out there. But I think the main thing is, can Daniel Smith and Mark Carney come to terms on the path forward in very short time period here?
Yeah, well, I asked Laura a similar question, but I'll put it to you, Brian. Are you a bit surprised that as the Prime Minister has grown closer to Alberta, has, seemed much more willing to support a pipeline project, that it hasn't kind of hurt him politically yet? I feel like we're all anticipating that once he does this, there'll be some, maybe some internal caucus dissent, but more importantly, there'll be a growth in support with the NDP. We haven't seen that yet. is it too early? Like, what's your kind of read on?
I'm certainly not an expert, Marco, in NDP Liberal switchers, but I can tell you that pipelines are popular in the country right now. Canadians, including British Columbians, are at least around that 50% mark on saying we need to move forward with this. They bought in that we need to do this. And I think timelines are a really important part. As I sit down with people from other countries, international leaders around the world, they're talking about building pipelines in like under a year to meet demands that they're seeing with increased oil prices for the next 10 years. We as Canadians have to be able to move quicker. And I think the Prime Minister has acknowledged that. Canadians have acknowledged that. And the fact of the matter is the economy is tough out there right now. At the end of the day, it's not just pipelines. There's a lot of projects that we need to think aspirationally. We need to be bigger and we need to move faster. As I've said, my concern on this, Marco, not so much on the pipeline side, but a lot of the major project stuff is, and you've seen it with the Cenovus CEO last week, picking one or two projects or 10 projects and carving out exemptions for them isn't giving certainty to industry or investors that we are the place to come and invest your money for entire industries. And that, I think, is going to be the downfall of a lot of this. Is we're seeing the conversation here today is how much money is government's going to put in this? Is the new fund that the government's putting out there able to invest in pipelines? Like, who is the private sector investor that's going to push and proponent that's going to push this pipeline forward and other projects?
I'm curious. I'd like to get Laura and Claire's opinion on this because I feel like this has been this big ideological debate between Pierre and Carney, where Pierre's saying this specialized boutique process for some projects isn't going to be as successful as just totally making some big broader regulatory approvals. Like, Laura, maybe it's an oversimplification of the debate here, but like, what vision do you think is winning out with Canadians, or do you think it's kind of, maybe a bit too in the weeds to kind of gain traction with the broader public?
Yeah, I think it's a bit in the weeds. I think to Brian's point, it's all part of this sort of like nationalist sort of pride, I think, that we've seen since President Trump came in and before the last election. And I think there's just a lot of hangover about that, which is why you see support for pipeline projects and major projects. And also one of the main reasons I think that the Liberals are still polling very well, even a year after the last election too. So I think there is appetite for the first time in a really long time in provinces where, even like in Quebec, but in the East Coast as well, where in BC as well too. I mean, we're seeing, not to do a sidebar on BC, which I guess we could talk about, but we're seeing like a total shift in narrative there on Indigenous issues and property rights. And that's sort of like, there's like a project component in there too, like it all kind of trickles down. So I just think, I thought Brian had a good point, which is that, there is a lot of, I think the Prime Minister and political leaders, even to some degree at the provincial level, have a lot of leeway right now to just sort of get things done that are in the national interest, which I think is why Conservatives are like, let's move along here. Cut down consultations. Like, if we all agree, let's just kind of get things going, and why they're supporting these sorts of job creating pieces of legislation as well. But yeah, I think it's actually, at least for me personally, like, I am happy about it. I hope that they can get something done so that we can create jobs. There's obviously a lot of industries here that have been really impacted by the trade war and that sort of thing. So it would be good to, and I think we just saw job losses this month even. So I think the Prime Minister has some leeway right now, but that's going to eventually run out. So hopefully he can start getting some things built before that happens.
So, yeah. What were you going to ask, Marco?
No, I was just going to kind of say, I know it's something you kind of mentioned too about like that appetite in this country for getting big things built. But yeah, I'm just curious, Pierre's point, with C5 was, he wasn't opposed to it. It's just, why do this instead of, why not just totally make huge regulatory overhaul? Maybe we're seeing the start of that right now, but I'm just wondering, what's your kind of take on that criticism?
The hardest kind of major projects to build are linear infrastructure, especially linear infrastructure that crosses provincial borders. So whether it's a pipeline, a transmission line, a rail line, these are the most difficult projects on all fronts. They're complicated legally. They're complicated from a consultation perspective. They're the most expensive. They have the most cooks in the kitchen. And so my, thought on those is that it's actually wise for the for the government not to do too many of those at the same time. I think they need to focus on a small number of ones that they can really achieve and really make progress on, because they take an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of money. And if you actually want to get them done, there has to be a very careful guiding through the regulatory process for those projects to succeed. If we're talking about non-linear infrastructure, this approach of having development zones is helpful, and having strategies that are sector-based, like the soon-to-be-released electricity strategy, like the government's done on critical minerals, like it's doing on the nuclear strategy. These sector-focused strategies really help bring all of the different players together to ensure those non-linear infrastructure projects can move forward. And what was the other thing that you were asking about? There's another half of what I was going to say.
I'm sorry. I even blanked on what I was saying.
I can't. I've tried to remember the second part, other than the point on linear infrastructure. Oh yeah, exactly. The point about the paper on Friday. So Friday is the government saying we need to overhaul the entire regulatory process. So I do think it addresses the criticism that the Building Canada Act is focused on a very small number of priority projects, and the Major Projects Office is focused on a small number of priority projects. I was glad to see the government take steps like have cooperation agreements with provinces on all projects and have regulatory changes on all projects. Do I agree with every single element in that discussion paper? No, not necessarily. But I think broadly it is a step in the right direction, and it does address that concern on a small number of priority projects. But like I said, I do think the government needs to have a small number of priority projects, especially when we're talking about linear infrastructure that's really, really hard to achieve.
And Aya, you did that excellent story a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, I should say, about major project zones. It's becoming this sexy new trend. There did a good explainer in terms of why they're useful. Why do you think it's becoming like a politically, attractive topic or politically attractive option? We've seen it in Ontario. Why is this the kind of regulatory meal of the day?
Well, because the global economy is so interconnected. So when the US starts this aggressive rollback of regulations, it sort of pulls everybody into that orbit. And I think that's something that we've seen throughout the world. But something that's interesting in the conversation that we're having is, a lot of it is we have to, streamline because we need to be more competitive because we're competing against. And the government often names the UK or Australia or these other jurisdictions that, if you look at the UK, for example, when they justify their regulatory streamlining agenda, they say, well, we have to compete against Canada. So it's just it's a bit of a race to the bottom where everyone's just trying to outdo each other. And this is where I worry that we might sort of let stuff slip through the cracks, right? And another thing that we're talking about, if we change the law, then it's easier to build a pipeline. Okay. But if we look at Northern Gateway, it's not the laws that quash that project, right? It's not the government had issued the permit. We might end up in the same situation where the government approves, issues the permit, and then it later gets, revoked because of a court decision. And I don't know
Same case with TMX, where it was a court decision that caused delay to the project.
Right. So are any of these regulations going to, help facilitate avoiding those kinds of situations in the future? I'm reading them. I'm not really seeing that. And if anything, this Crown Consultation Hub, I think, was pitched as a way to sort of help with the fears that are coming with some of these proposed regulations. But I know that the Assembly of First Nations have had emergency meetings all week, and they haven't even spoken about the regulatory reforms yet because they are kind of shocked by what's in them. And I don't anticipate they'll be very happy with the proposal. I think the chief says she's going to speak tomorrow. But I don't know that we're heading down the path of certainty with those regulations that aim to bring certainty.
I just want to say I really agree with Aya on the litigation risk here, especially with the economic zones, huge litigation risk. It's all going to depend on how the government can work with provinces, Indigenous communities, local groups to carefully select zones that really will welcome the kind of development that is already being proposed in that area. They're going to take time. I think the approach can work, but it is also extremely possible for it to go sideways. So the government's just going to have to be really careful on its implementation.
But Claire, aren't these regulations, part of it is to help some of the riskier projects move along, right? You're not going to use these big tools for projects that don't have any risk, because if they don't have any risk, then they technically don't really need that help. right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly how the zones are going to be used. I think there are going to be projects that are already well advanced that will not want to become part of a zone because that would, in fact, risk delay. If they believe that the existing process that they're going through, they're submitting their studies, they're getting all their permits, they've already done their Indigenous consultation, they have agreements with Indigenous groups already, they may choose to try to stay away from this concept of a zone. But there may be other projects that need the assistance. If you've got multiple different mines, for example, in a single region, it could make sense for those projects to be doing consultations jointly with municipalities, and also to make sure that related projects are interconnected, right? If you've got a mining project near where a proposed transmission line is happening, I do think it makes a lot of sense. One thing that a lot of people didn't notice in the paper, there's also a separate proposal to designate national trade corridors, which I thought was fascinating. It's a separate amendment, not actually under the Impact Assessment Act, but under the Canada Transportation Act. And that's an attempt to work with the Canadian port authorities and improve the efficiency and the logistics of some of our major ports. So I'm really also interested to see what the text of those amendments look like and what sort of powers and tools are given to those national trade corridors, which right now have only been funded through the National Trade Corridors Fund at Transport Canada, but have not been supported through our regulatory system.
Brian, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to comment that, like, Aya's talked about it, but like duty to consult is the elephant in the room that I don't see being resolved with this, and it's still going to be a major inhibitor on any of the. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It's if that's not addressed, you're not going to speed up a lot of any of these projects that are, as Claire talks about, especially these linear ones, without making sure that First Nations are involved at the forefront and believe that they've been consulted properly.
And if I may add, like when we went to the Prospectors and Developers Convention in Toronto earlier this year, a lot of the mining proponents wanted nothing to do with Ontario's special economic zones, and honestly didn't want to be on a fast track list either. And you saw that, like Wailu Metals and the Ring of Fire, like literally said to the provincial government, please don't put us on that list. Told the federal government, we do not want to be designated. Like, don't involve us in this. Like, our project is already sort of slowly making its way. Any of these things are too risky right now. I think we're going to see that with these current proposals.
Is that, just a question, is that because they are worried that it's going to restart them and like actually move them backwards?
They worry that like the partnerships that they've built with First Nations is going to hurt their relationship with them if they try to get on a fast track, because these First Nations have been building that relationship for years. They've been talked about, Indigenous assessment, and then when you get the federal government involved with this new kind of untested experimental legislation, it increases the risk for a project that otherwise is advancing.
In the project approval space, none of my clients want to be the first one to try a new process, right? You want regulatory certainty, and regulatory certainty means watching the precedents of other projects that have gone through a process and just understanding how long it's going to take so that they can tell their investors, their partners, their Indigenous partners what the process is. So, it's very tricky because I understand why the government wants to experiment and work on some of these new systems. Like I said, some of them I think are very good, but how they're implemented is a huge question mark. And at the same time, you're going to have a lot of proponents that just want the certainty of going through the existing process. And on the duty to consult point, I mean, we have a number of clients where, in fact, it's an Indigenous group that is either the project proponent or partnering closely with the project proponent. We often talk about Indigenous groups as if they're a group to be consulted, but often they are the project, and they are just as much interested in ensuring that they get those approvals because they are the beneficiaries or a partner or part of a community benefit agreement on a project. So, I mean, I think this is said often enough in Canada now that Indigenous people should never be seen as wholesale barriers to project development. They're not. They're often the project proponents, they're the project partners, and they're just such an important part of the major project conversation in Canada and shouldn't just be seen as a barrier.
So then with a pipeline through to Kitimat, you don't see the BC coastal First Nations as a barrier to that happening?
I think we've got to listen to what those local Indigenous groups are saying about what kind of projects they want on their land that are going to affect them and their waters. And I think there's a lot of major projects in Canada including linear infrastructure projects where Indigenous groups are supporting them or may want to be owners in those projects. So I just think that specific example, I think if those groups are concerned, then that is their prerogative to express those concerns. That's just a piece of the puzzle. There are other Indigenous groups who have different interests on that project, as they will on other pipelines, transmission lines in that part of the country.
And I should say, Kitimat's been ruled out as a potential exit point too.
Because
shallower waters, complicated history with Northern Gateway. It's like Prince Rupert is Alberta's preference, and then the federal government looking at a southern route, maybe twinning Trans Mountain for part of the route, maybe.
But isn't, and I'm happy to be corrected here, isn't a lot of the reason why you're looking at multiple different routes because of needing to find paths through First Nations communities that are supportive of those initiatives?
I would say paths with Indigenous groups where they can benefit from the projects. I think Indigenous groups benefiting from projects is, and not just Indigenous, any local people benefiting from a project is generally a way to gain support, because when you have a project that goes through someone's community, but they don't get to see the benefit of it, it's a lot harder to find that support for it. So that's why the partnership piece is so critical. I think it's a reason why in Ontario, the wind turbine situation didn't go very well, because you had lots of communities in Ontario that were not seeing the benefits of wind projects, onshore wind projects being developed. And we've learned from that. And I think the lesson is ensure that communities are benefiting and that projects are happening in partnership, not to a community.
And I'll just move on to our final topic. It's municipal election season now that we've started candidate registration. iPolitics, as part of our work with our local news outlets, Compass News, are partnering with Liaison Strategies to do some exclusive polling. Our first kind of release for the Ottawa race showed a lot of dissatisfaction with the Sutcliffe regime on a myriad of issues, and then also really, really strong disapproval with the Lansdowne redevelopment. Laura, you're kind of on the ground and familiar with this. I'm from Ottawa, so none of this surprises me, but I'm just wondering, does any of this kind of, present an opportunity for challengers to Mr. Sutcliffe?
Yeah, I think so. And full disclosure, I'm volunteering on Alex Lawson's campaign. I've never volunteered or worked really significantly in municipal politics, but felt like now was really important. I think probably similarly to the reason I feel this way is it kind of correlates to a lot of people in the city being unhappy, I think, with the last few years. I voted for Mark Sutcliffe and was hopeful that things would turn around. And I think if you live or work or are commuting downtown in any way, whether that not just be the market anymore, but to Lansdowne, to the Glebe, to Chinatown, down Somerset, like the drug use and drug paraphernalia and homelessness issue is just absolutely out of control. It even feels worse than a year or two ago. It's just getting worse literally by the day, which is a huge problem for a ton of reasons, obviously, and doesn't really seem to be sort of defies logic how it is getting so significantly worse so quickly. Transit, tons of other issues as well. I think the polling that iPolitics has shared is interesting. I think the undecideds are very, very high, which I think shows that the mayor is vulnerable. I think people are looking for literally any other option to vote for other than him. And if those options are presented, then I think he shouldn't be vulnerable, but he is. The transit issues are endless. And Marco, you're from Ottawa and have lived here. I've lived here for close to 20 years. So it somehow also has gotten worse. Like, I just think generally people think that things are worse in the city than they were 4 years ago.
Brian, is that a fair read of the kind of state of the race right now? To Laura's point too, about how it seems like there's this constellation of forces working against Sutcliffe's re-election right now.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I agree with Laura, and the baffling part is, while spending $100 million on homelessness in the last couple of years, these things are worse. I actually think was in Toronto, Barrie, Brampton, a few other communities this week, and the polling I've seen throughout the province, throughout the country, I think people are generally not feeling like the economy's tough. They're worried about their future. They're worried about their children's future. And it's really a compliment to Mark Carney that he's been able to kind of capture this, and people are, he's one of the few governments that people are placing their trust and vote in. So even I think you're seeing a lot of mayors that would normally be relatively safe. This is not a province that, unelects mayors very, very are vulnerable, because I think the population seems to be, from the polling, seems to be kind of grumpy. And as an old politician, I know this isn't scientific, but every time I get in an Uber or a cab, I start chatting them up and asking their views on it. And you'll find that people are worried about it right now. And I think that does leave politicians like Mayor Sutcliffe and many others vulnerable to the upcoming election. It's yet to be seen whether anybody can really coalesce a set of policies that are going to really attract people. But certainly we've seen in our polling, there's a lot of discontent with not just transit, but actually traffic and ability to move around the city. Obviously, Lansdowne, I was surprised, Marco, with that question, how unpopular it was across the entire city, because why would you make that decision as a council in an election year if it was actually going to be that unpopular? But yeah, I agree with Laura.
Or did that surprise you on Lansdowne that it was that unpopular considering the broad support it had at council?
Well, funny you should say that. It actually only has support on council from councillors that don't represent downtown areas for the most part. It didn't surprise me too much. The number was high. I think the amount was surprising. On our campaign, we've been hearing about it a lot. Alex has been meeting with tons and tons of stakeholders for months, and it's come up repeatedly. So I wasn't super surprised, but I think from feedback that I got from other people, including just regular folks in Ottawa, I think people did not realize that it was that divided. And I think there is a significant divide if you actually go there, or live in the area. People support things that aren't in their neck of the woods necessarily, or if they go there a couple of times a year. So, and listen, I think like developing, bringing economic development to Lansdowne or elsewhere is great. I just think there's so many other things, to Brian's point about, $100 million being spent on homelessness. There's tons of money that has been wasted on transit as well. Things like bathrooms that are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tons of ways. So I just think in the grand scheme of things, there are other things that need attention more so. And that's maybe where people are at. It just depends where you live.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just, I'll leave it there. But one thing we do before we wrap up every show is give you all an opportunity to talk about one thing you're either looking forward to in the coming week or something you're looking, you want to maybe flag in the week that just happened. I'll start with you, Aya.
Yeah. So we heard earlier this week that the government is considering keeping its ownership of Trans Mountain. I think the plan was to transfer at least part of the ownership to Indigenous groups, and some coalitions of First Nations interested in purchasing an equity stake formed years ago, and they've been trying to get there. And I think it's interesting because very few large pipeline projects have walked down this path of Indigenous equity, right? We had Enbridge with that 12th take, but we haven't seen how that's going to work out for Trans Mountain. And I think it would be interesting if we saw First Nation equity into a new proposed Northwest Bitumen pipeline, but we had no Indigenous equity in Trans Mountain. I feel like some First Nations along the route might be upset by that.
That's a good point. How about you, Claire?
I wasn't sure exactly what this question was about, so I just thought of something much more personal, which is that my 5-year-old and I just made a coloring book using AI, using pictures on my phone of East Toronto landmarks, and we're selling it in support of our local hospital, Michael Guerin. And if there's any listeners here from East Toronto and you want to buy a coloring book, send me a DM. They're $15. And it was a super fun project. I feel like I'm using AI in so many interesting ways right now, whether it's at work through my legal stuff, whether it's for my personal life. And fun fact, you can make a coloring book really, really easily using just pictures on your phone.
That's so cool. I love that. How about you, Laura?
Well, I kind of already talked about it a little bit. I've been spending a little bit more time than I thought I would caring about municipal politics in Ottawa. Also, just following federal politics as I normally do. So I have some travel coming up, and that's about it. I've talked about it enough.
Absolutely. And Brian, I'll give you the last word.
Well, you always take the last word, Marco, but I want Laura to know we're 100% pro-pet on this podcast. Yeah, anytime. Honestly, I wanted to kind of touch, I guess, in a way on Claire's point with AI, data centers, everything going on. Energy, electricity is just going to be such an important piece of any province or government's future. And I wanted to give a shout out to Minister Lecce. He has been very busy and very active in getting Ontario prepared for the onslaught of electricity and energy usage that's going to be needed. I think it's great to see a cabinet minister that is being as aggressive to actually getting things done like we haven't seen in generations.
So Brian, spill the secret. I do like to have the last word. And the thing I'm looking forward to is really this, I won't take too much time, just the MOU. What are we going to see there? Are we going to finally see a deal? I'm really interested to see what the fallout will be. and just also to see, to both Aya and Claire's point, those dates, how those align, and whether or not we have a clear strategy to get to net zero by 2050, or we move the sticks a bit further down. That being said, thank you, Laura, Claire, and Aya, for joining us on this episode. And Brian, thanks always for chairing that co-host, being my co-host on this. And of course, thank you all for listening and watching. We'll have a new episode next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.